So what I want to do for you in this conversation is break down really the big broad strokes of how pranayama was practiced and what its intentions were in the broader, more traditional forms of Hatha Yoga or Hatha Yoga, and also how pranayama was practiced and how it was perceived in the Patanjali or the Raja-based lineages. Now, when we do this, everybody, as we go into this, to me, it's fascinating. It's intellectually really powerful and transformative. And at the same time, it's going to require us to go deep because the place where we really need to start is the mechanism of liberation. And what we have to do is confront something that I think a lot of contemporary teachers aren't aware of, is that the more traditional forms of Hatha Yoga and the Yoga Sutra attributed to Patanjali are not the same. They are very distinct protocols, and they have very different belief systems with different historical mechanisms of liberation and transcendence. And pranayama techniques were very different in these two modalities. And the pranayama techniques reflect the varying mechanism of liberation. So in order to really make sense of why this school did this and this school did that, I think we need to go into the mechanism of liberation and the essence of the belief system. Now, this is not particularly simple or easy to do in a concise, succinct way, but I'm gonna do my best. So, in a Patanjali worldview, right, as the Yoga Sutra attributed to Patanjali, in a more originalist Patanjali worldview, you know the mechanism of liberation. It's the second sutra. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. In Patanjali's worldview, self-transcendence or liberation happened from having a still mind, period. Now, there's a lot that went into that, and there's a lot of nuance there. But Patanjali was really looking for a meditative state in which we could see our true self, which was, according to Patanjali and scholars of Sankhya prior to Patanjali, the belief that liberation came from seeing our true self, which meant our ability to remove Purusha from Prakriti. Prakriti can be thought of as all of the things that are tangible. Prakriti is the world of matter, but it's also the inner world of sensation, thought, and feeling. So in Patanjali's worldview, or in Sankhya's worldview, which predates the Patanjali, Prakriti was everything that is nameable, everything that is not pure spirit. It's not how we think about it now as mind and matter, because all of the contents or all of the attributes of mind in Patanjali's worldview were materialistic. So all of the thoughts and all of the feelings and all of the objects of the universe were the same. They were all Prakriti. And Purusha, the simplest way to think about it, is that which animates, pure consciousness, pure spirits. And in Patanjali's worldview, we were trying to become still enough so that the Prakriti was no longer moving and we could witness our true self, which is Purusha or pure consciousness. I'm going to give you, because it's a lot of words there, right? I'm going to give you a little image. Imagine you're in a pool, like a 5-foot deep pool. And imagine there's like a logo or something on the bottom of the pool or an object on the bottom of the pool. In order to make out that object or that logo clearly, all of the water needs to not move. If there's any movement of the water, if there's any wave movement at the surface of the water or anywhere therein, you're not going to be able to make out the thing on the bottom. So in Patanjali's worldview, the self was comprised of both Prakriti and Purusha, but we needed to make all of the Prakriti still enough, all of the water wave-like movement still enough that we could truly perceive the pure spirit that lies within. And the only way that we could perceive it is by making it still. So that's where Patanjali lays out this clear mechanism of liberation. Liberation happens and can only happen when everything is perfectly still, including thought, feeling, and all constituents of self. Okay? Now, the mechanism of liberation in Hatha Yoga is completely different. What we're looking for in the Patanjali worldview is a pure place of meditative absorption, stillness, and non-fluctuation. That's when we can perceive the true self, and that is the mechanism of transcendence and self-liberation. That's from an originalist interpretation. The mechanism of liberation in the Hatha Yoga world is way different and kind of wild in its own way. And I don't mean that in any dismissive way. I mean it in a, this is intellectually fascinating stuff. Okay, so what we have to kind of see with the mechanism of liberation in more traditional forms of Hatha Yoga is that liberation or transcendence of self comes not from the pure stillness of mind, it comes from awakening Kundalini. What is that and how is it done? In traditional Hatha Yoga esoteric anatomy, there are many different nadis. There's 72,000 nadis, there's 48,000 nadis. The different books give different numbers. And oftentimes what you see in traditional Hatha Yoga texts like the Shiva Samhita, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the Garanda Samhita, there's many more, but those are big parts of the canon. What you'll see is big numbers, like big numbers. There are 72,000 of this. There are 48,000 of this. But only 16 really matter. And of those 16, only 4 matter. And of those 4, 3 are really important, right? And we see this like pretty continuously when it comes to traditional Hatha Yoga techniques. A massive number is thrown out, like a massive number of poses, techniques, bandhas, and then a smaller number is kind of factored in, and then a much smaller number is factored in, and then, but really these are the important ones, okay? And to be honest with you, I like that. I don't mind that, all right? Do I think it's a little bit rooted in a culture of exaggeration? Yeah, maybe there's some hyperbole there, but I'm always for someone saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff out there, but this is the really core concept. So the core nadis, okay? Remember there's 72,000, but really there's 48,000, but really there's 16, but really there's 4, but now there's 3. There's 3 that you need to know. The 3 quintessential nadis that we need to understand, or nadi is a conduit for energy, okay? The 3 quintessential nadis that we need to have an understanding of in this worldview is the central channel, the Sushumna nadi, which is considered to be the most gracious channel. The Ida nadi, which is a spiraling nadi that spirals around the Sushumna nadi and has its origin in the left nostril. And then the Pingala nadi, which is the same spiraling nadi, which has its origin in the right nostril. Okay, so 3 nadis. You have a central channel, and you have 2 spiraling channels that spiral around the central channel. The Pingala originating in the right, the Ida originating in the left, which has an interesting relationship to later techniques of Vedana-based breathing and also Nadi Shodhana-based breathing, okay? But again, this is just big picture here. It was also believed, it is still amongst traditional Hatha yogis believed, that there is a dormant energetic serpent that lives at the base of the spine, coiled in essentially a nest, which is called the kunda. and that the goal of Hatha Yoga was to awaken the Kundalini, to awaken that serpent that is dormant at the base of the spine. And upon it awakening, it shoots up. Some of the texts refer to it being straightened like a stick. So you have a coiled serpent, referred to as Kundalini, at the base of the spine. And your intention through the various techniques of Hatha Yoga was to stimulate it or awaken it. Upon awakening, it would stand up and shoot up like a stick, and all of the energy would be pierced upwards from the base of the spine through the Sushumna Nadi, being transported through the various chakras, and that is what leads to self-transcendence or awakening. So in both of these worldviews, traditional Hatha Yoga and in Patanjali's worldview, the aspirant or the student is looking for liberation. These are moksha shastra pedagogies, liberation teaching. But in Patanjali's worldview, that liberation or that self-transcendence came from ultimate stillness. In in Hatha Yoga's worldview, that liberation or that self-transcendence did not come from ultimate stillness, although led to ultimate stillness, but it actually came from awakening the dormant serpent at the base of the spine and having that serpent pierce through all of those different loops or wheels or spirals within and create a higher state of consciousness in which we could perceive the true self and no longer be bound to our temporary self. In both of these methodologies, we were looking, in both of these methodologies, aspirants were looking to transcend their temporary self and access the part of self that is undying. Okay? Now, that's a lot, but it's interesting and it's accurate. So you can imagine that the role and the technique of pranayama in these two worldviews is different. If I want a still, quiet consciousness in which there is no thoughts, no feeling, no inner movement, no cogitation, I'm going to do breathing techniques that are really quiet, that are really still, that are not stimulating. Remember, in the Patanjali worldview, because the mechanism of liberation was pure stillness, the breathing is really about cessation. It's really about stopping or slowing the movement of the breath. In Hatha Yoga's worldview, I'm trying to awaken a dormant serpent at the base of my spine. You think I'm going to do that by like sneaking around? No. All of the pranayama techniques in traditional Hatha Yoga were essentially hugely stimulating. They were trying to force the energy of these two channels into the base of the spine to awaken the serpent, so that serpent stands up and awakens and pierces through consciousness. So everybody, a lot of times in modern teaching, the perspective of Hatha Yoga is sun and moon. It's not sun and moon. It is the conjunction of the sun and moon. That's very different. Ha and ta, sun and moon. Ida in Pingala. The moon channel, the left side, Ida. The right side, the sun channel or the solar channel, the Pingala, were to be merged. So the tradition of Hatha Yoga often goes by the belief of forcefully pulling these opposites together to create this ignition and spark. So we have a different perspective if we think it's the balance between the sun and the moon, or the crushing together of the sun and the moon. I'm all good in a modern setting. Let's just stick with the balance of the sun and the moon. That's all good. But in a traditional context, it's not about balancing the sun and balancing the moon and achieving balance. It's about forcing them together in order to awaken that dormant power and serpent within. So what does this really lead to? Well, it leads to techniques that are profoundly different from each other. The techniques that originate from the traditional Hatha Yoga worldview or practices or perspective are much more about energy and about cleansing. These techniques are really rooted in a spirit of purification and energy regulation and stimulation, more so than stillness, right? Because again, we really have to understand what is the end goal of the technique, right? We always have to begin with what is the intention of the technique, not what technique should we use. The first question always to ask yourself is not what technique do I use? The first question is, what is the desired outcome? Let me determine the technique based on the desired outcome. So when the desired outcome of traditional Hatha Yoga is awakening Kundalini in order to pierce through consciousness and deliver transcendence, then we're going to be utilizing techniques that are much more focused in energy and purification. There's a pretty strong reliance on Kapalabhati. There's a pretty strong reliance on Bhastrika. There's a pretty large reliance on the incorporation of bandhas and mudras, right? So the traditional techniques or perspective on pranayama in traditional Hatha Yoga is more forceful, more. I don't want to say this the wrong way. More invasive. These were not mostly designed for stillness and self-soothing. These were mostly designed for chronic manipulation and retention towards the end of stimulating Kundalini. Also, when it comes to traditional Hatha Yoga, there's a fair amount of description of pranayama and techniques. In those primary source books, there's a lot of information, right? I should say this, there is as much information about pranayama, mudra, and bandha as there is asana. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Patanjali. Now, Patanjali has a very different intention, right? There's more of a mental and psychological focus rooted in subtle breath regulation and rooted in making the breath quiet. Patanjali gave us profoundly little information and technique. We know Patanjali valued pranayama. We also know the hierarchy with which Patanjali placed pranayama, right? In the 8 limbs, we have our yamas, our niyamas, our asana, then our pranayama. So pranayama is considered by where it's located in Patanjali's text and Patanjali's hierarchy. Pranayama is considered a more subtle technique, a more refined technique, a more nuanced skill set than asana. Asana is a preparation for pranayama. Pranayama is a preparation for meditation. Meditation is a preparation for pure absorption. Pure absorption is a preparation for samadhi and transcendence. But Patanjali doesn't give us much info, right? And you know, from even if you have just had the most casual passing of Patanjali, he doesn't give that much information about asana either, right? And we, in a modern era, we make a lot of Patanjali's wisdom that an asana should have the dual qualities of effort and relaxation, but he's not really giving us techniques there. He's giving us a tone, but he's not really giving us a technique. It's the same thing with pranayama in Patanjali's world. He's not really ever provided technique. He's more giving a tone. He's saying that the breath mostly should be quieter, longer, and smoother. And we can read in to Patanjali's perspective based on the mechanism of liberation and a broader understanding of Patanjali's worldview, that Patanjali was interested in the breath becoming very still and very quiet. Patanjali was probably not a real deep breather. Clearly not an advocate for Kapalabhati, for Bhastrika, for lengthened box breathing. There's none of that. So in the very simple short of it, from the Patanjali's worldview, pranayama was to be quiet, slow, smooth, still, completely non-evasive. You can imagine that Patanjali was trying to make the pranic fluctuation quiet, still, and ultimately with no movement. On the other side of the spectrum, the opposite. On the other side of the spectrum, from traditional Hatha Yoga practices, much more vigorous, much more stimulating, much more rooted in cleansing, purification, energetic retention, and management.